Thank you, everyone. I'm here to talk about your path to modernization and cloud-native architectures with AWS. As we help our customers down this path of moving from legacy architectures, whether they be monolithic, on-premise architectures, or architectures that are already in the AWS cloud, it's really important that you have to understand where you are starting from with your current state of your applications. And you have to be honest with yourself, and you have to include your team in determining where these applications currently stand. Are we using legacy technologies? If we're still running in the data center, what are the constraints that we're operating under? Where are the problems with these architectures? And we need all of that to be listed out, and we have to be honest with ourselves to understand the current state of our architectures. If you're running things on a Microsoft stack, what versions of the .NET framework are you using? What versions of the database are you using? If you're running more on a Linux environment, if you're running with Java or some of the other frameworks, what versions of Java are you on? And we need to know all these pieces of information so that we know the starting line as we start to look towards how we can modernize these applications to make them cloud native. We also need to know our options as we start to work on how are we going to modernize these things. And it's really important, again, work with your teams, list out every option that we can do as we move into the cloud. And that's where we can help at PwC. We have the cloud expertise to work with your teams to identify what all your options are. And with the 190 plus services from AWS, you're not going to be using or looking at even a majority of those. You're going to be focusing in on the ones that can really improve your applications as you move forward. And as we look at the options, we want to look at things like, what are the options with regard to our databases? If we're on a Microsoft stack, is moving to something like Babelfish for Aurora Postgres an option? Or do we need to take a more conservative approach and look at just, can we move Microsoft SQL Server onto a Linux operating system, thereby saving 20% of our cost just by getting rid of the Windows OS for hosting our database? Or do we need to go all the way to purpose-built databases? Do we have that opportunity to move that far forward? Other things to consider around our options are containers. But as you start to look at containers, don't necessarily make the jump immediately to Kubernetes-based solutions. In AWS, we have 17 different ways that we can run containers on top of the AWS cloud. Do you need what comes with Kubernetes, or do you just need a simpler way to run and deploy those containers with something like ECS? Or can we make the leap all the way to serverless and look at things like Lambda? So when you start to look at, are you going to make that leap all the way to serverless, you're probably going to start looking at having to rewrite a lot of your code. When we help our customers start to think about what's that going to look like, we also start to talk about what language frameworks do we want to use as we move forward. But let me back up for a minute as we talk about this modernization of our Microsoft and .NET-based applications into the cloud. We have a huge opportunity that we see a lot of our customers do as step one, is just to say, can I take and run my .NET applications in a Linux environment as opposed to a Windows environment? That requires you to be at least on .NET Core 3. But if we can help our customers, if we can help you as our customers get to that, you can save 50% on your operating costs simply by making the change away from Microsoft's Windows OS to a Linux OS. Then if we start to look at making a move to containers, we can save another 10 to 20%. So now we're talking about saving 50 to 60% on your current run rate by getting rid of the Microsoft Windows OS and moving you onto a containers platform. If we have the option to go all the way to a Lambda type framework and serverless, we're seeing customers save up to 90% of their current run rate by moving all the way to serverless. However, you have to understand in making that move to serverless, you're probably going to undertake a larger amount of rewrite for your application. And at times we find that developers aren't ready to make the leap all the way to serverless as well. So you have to find the balance. Other things to think about as you're knowing your options with your Windows-based architectures is how are you going to handle things like queues and event buses. There's solutions in AWS for every one of those. As we look at those Linux-based applications, that might be running legacy Java, again, a natural inclination is to look towards moving to containers and also maybe moving to serverless. Some of the same things apply. You're not going to see as much cost savings in a Linux environment of moving to containers as you do in the Microsoft case, but you'll still see percentage savings by getting to containers. But where everybody really wants to get to these days is to that serverless framework, because that's where the money savings is. And actually, if we consider ESG for a moment, we're going to be seeing, I think, a big drive towards how do we help customers build the most energy efficient architectures. And I believe that this is going to be driving us even more towards the serverless and platform services that AWS has to offer, because those inherently are the most energy efficient services and architectures that we can use with our customers. So again, with the Linux-based approach and an application, we're probably looking at something that's running on an Oracle database today in the data center or in the cloud. We probably want to start looking at options to move away from that Oracle engine, moving to things like Amazon Aurora MySQL or Amazon Aurora Postgres. And again, looking where can we leverage things like DynamoDB, Redshift, DocumentDB, and Neptune as other database services particular to the types of data that we might be working with. So there's lots of options on how we can help you and your teams get to a cloud-native architecture. But the technical is only one piece of that. We'll also help you plan that path. And when you start to plan out the path to modern architectures, there's a couple things that we really want to keep in mind. First off, we want to keep in mind our team. What is the current skills assessment of our team? And how much training and education are we going to have to put into our team to enable them to work with the latest and greatest technologies from AWS? You've heard me already talk about databases, but we really need to look at the databases carefully and think about what can we really touch in that database tier. Make no mistake, modernizing your database is probably one of the hardest and most time-consuming pieces of your project, but it's also where you stand to gain the most return on investment. But we have to be realistic with ourselves in the early phases of just how much can we do with that database? Or are we better off to get some gains early by making a move to containers or to serverless and then coming back and looking at the database later on? And then we need to think about the business. What are the business drivers for doing these changes? What impact is it going to have on the business? What is hurting the business today that's driving us to make these changes? And then finally, we need to pull all this together and understand what are the changes that are going to happen to our technical teams, to our operations teams. Are our operations teams even ready to operate a new cloud-native architecture inside of AWS? Again, we can help you with some of this. Once the decision's been made and you think you have a candidate for moving forward with, you're going to have to sell that path to the business. Because I've yet to see anybody just come along and give a development team a bucket of money and say, run with it. We have to be prepared to quantify what is going to be the return for the business on doing this work. So if you're a development team lead and you're trying to understand how am I going to sell this opportunity to the business, here's a couple things to keep in mind. First, understand what kind of team you're going to need and how many Scrum teams you may need if you follow an agile process. And be honest with yourself, do you have the skills in-house to do this work? Or are you going to need to spend money on training? Or are you going to have to hire people? Once you understand what the team makeup is going to be, now you have a head count and now you can derive cost. And also you can start to plan out how much time are you going to need to start doing this rework. That's step one in selling the path, is understanding some of the costs. But now also start to understand and quantify what is going to be the return to the business of doing this work. So things like, what is going to be your future run rate inside of AWS? How much money do you think you're going to save the business by putting these new technologies into place from a pure cost standpoint? But also quantify it back to the business and what it means to the business. For instance, we're working with one customer that it's taking them about 6 months to roll their application out to any new customer. It's an all hands on deck activity, and it's very cumbersome because they haven't invested in the automation to deploy their application to a new customer. With the rework that we're doing in their architecture, the rewrite of their platform, we're going to reduce that time to about 2 months with a small, dedicated team. No more all hands on deck to onboard a customer. The company can continue to move forward. So understand the business pain points and how your rework to a cloud-native architecture is going to enable the business to be able to move faster. A few other things to think about around, selling this path forward is think about what is going to be the soft costs that the business might realize. So this isn't about reducing headcount in an organization. I tend to think about this as getting higher level activities out of individuals by relieving them of non-value added work. The best example I usually like to use around this is your database administrators. There's not a lot of value in a database administrator constantly monitoring the servers, patching them, monitoring CPU, monitoring memory, monitoring disk. The real value of the DBA in your organization is developing and working with the developers to develop better data models, to optimize query performance, to make these applications run faster so that the business results are better. So that's a soft cost that you need to think through to, again, take that back to the business as some of the gains of making this change. Some examples we've seen with some of our customers. We've recently migrated a customer from your traditional Microsoft .NET architecture, monolithic in nature, running on top of a SQL Server database. The application had become riddled with technical debt. It had become fragile. Every time they tried to make a change to the system, things would break for unknown reasons. They had a lot of turnover in their development teams and had lost a lot of tribal knowledge about the application. But taking this approach, we identified a number of opportunities for this customer to move forward. Things like jumping all the way to serverless with Lambda. We decided to keep the .NET framework for them, so everything was written in C#. We moved the databases to Aurora Postgres. This customer is seeing a 90% decrease in cost to operate and run this environment in the AWS cloud. This is a huge advantage for them as a business, as this application is a core platform to what their business does. In another case, we've had a customer, they were operating in AWS, but the current architecture was an older architecture, more monolithic in nature. And they were having issues scaling this application to meet the needs of their customers. We've worked with them. We identified a path forward that included moving to a mixture of both containers and Lambda functions on top of AWS. And we're actually moving them away from the Java programming language to Python. The reason we're moving them to Python is they're doing a lot with AI and ML modeling. A lot of that is based in the Python language. By moving all the services and the core application code to Python, we're now getting them to a single language. So the development team becomes a little bit more generic in skill capability. We don't have to worry, do we have enough Java developers to support the core application and enough Python developers to support the AI and ML pieces of the application? It's going to be a single, language code base across it so we can share the development teams a little bit more. All these things are going to lead to this organization seeing at least a 50% reduction in cost to operate. But the customer is also going to now be able to onboard their customers at a much faster rate into their application architecture. Once you have everything ready to sell the path to the business, and you get that approval, and you get that bucket of money to go out and start building this solution for the business, you want to be able to show back to the business as you're making progress. Because again, this is really important. And there's a couple other things that you want to do in the initial phases of starting this build out. First, make sure that you're building on a strong foundation inside of AWS. Things like, do you have the right account structures? Do you have the right organizational structure? Do you have the right security controls in place? Now is the time to put those things into place for these new applications. If we put security in place at the beginning, it's there and the environment will be secure from day one. We have to continue to monitor that, but it's a lot easier to do it in the very beginning than it is to try to bolt it on at the end. And so again, evaluate, be honest with yourself and your teams of, do we have the right things in place in the AWS environment for this new application to go into? Automate everything. I can't stress this enough. The organizations that are moving the fastest have everything automated, hands-off deployments into their production environments, and they reduce the use of the AWS console to be read-only to go look at metrics and logs. Nobody is allowed to make a change to the environment if it is not done through automation. Invest in this. It is critically important if you want your organization to be able to move quickly. Other things that you want to do is you want to be very public and open with the management team of where do things stand. Things like, what does the backlog look like? Run backlog reviews. Do the Scrum ceremonies of doing demos at the end of each Scrum cycle. And show the progress. If your Scrum cycles are every 2 weeks, you should be pushing to code to production every 2 weeks. Even if you haven't achieved the point that you've built that minimally viable product or minimally lovable product that's truly ready for customer use, exercise those muscles on how to push the code out to production from day one. So that when you're really ready to open the floodgates and allow the customers into your new application, you're not scrambling to understand how to get it deployed out to production. It's a muscle. You have the muscle memory, and you've been using your automation all along as you've been building this application. Your internal business customers can see where the work has been going on. They can see where the money has been spent and they can see that they're getting something out of this. And continue just to be very transparent with the organization as the path is moving forward. And what you'll find is by the end of your journey, you're going to have something new that's built in AWS that should be more efficient, that's going to serve your customers better. But remember what I said when we were talking about knowing your options. This is not a one and done type of approach. The most successful customers we see is this becomes an iterative approach. I call it the flywheel approach. So in the beginning, maybe my first jump is I'm taking my monolithic architecture into containers and microservices. Maybe my team isn't ready to make the leap to Lambda. But as they get more comfortable with how to start to deploy microservices into containers, we've seen customers then start to adopt Lambda because now the development team has advanced enough that they understand that. Then once you start to get the cost savings of taking the cost out of the front end, going back to my example of moving away from a .NET stack running on top of Windows to .NET running in containers, from taking it all the way to Lambda, getting that 50, 60, 70, maybe 80% cost savings in one piece of the application. Take that money that's been saved, reinvest it into the next iteration of modernizing your application, and now maybe with the rewrite of the front-end code, you're ready to start to, now you have a better understanding of what it's going to take to dive into the database side and really look at what it's going to take the cost out of the database side and the complexity out of the database side by moving away from the licensed database engines to the open source engines. So what you'll see from a business standpoint, your expense run rates may hold steady for a couple of years, but then you're going to see a dramatic decrease in cost once you've gone through a couple cycles and you've reinvested the cost savings from the first pieces of your modernization. And when you finally get this application to a state that you've eliminated proprietary operating system costs, eliminated proprietary database costs, you're going to see a dramatic reduction overall of the cost to operate and run these applications. And if done correctly, the business is going to be more agile. It's going to be able to roll out new features into the code base faster. You're going to have automation to push those feature changes out into production in a hands-off way, at a low-risk way. So these are some of the ways that we're helping our customers today, and we'd like to help you find your path to modern application architectures in AWS. Thank you, and look forward to talking to you again soon.